Right, and now looking at the last bit of My Last Duchess, finally we got through it together. It is a long poem with a lot to talk about, but here we go. So we ended with Then All Smells Stopped Together. So here we have another caesura, and remember caesuras are pauses which really give you a chance to absorb what is said, and usually with speeches, this is a dramatic monologue, there is a kind of pause there as if the Duke is kind of pausing for dramatic effect. And then we've got there she stands as if alive, and we remember back to the beginning of the poem where the Duke actually says something very similar. He says, "That's my last Duchess, painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive." And I didn't mention this before, but I'm going to do it now. We've got this conjunction if. And what this conjunction if is for is to bring something conditional to the forefront, right? And what I mean by that, simply put, is conjunction is usually used to connect two different clauses together. Clause, of course, being a fancy word for a sentence. And in this case, we've got that clause, there she stands as if, and then that if connects us to this other clause, as if alive. So essentially what the conjunction if does is it introduces something conditional, and what conditional means is something that may or may not be true. It depends. So in this case, the conjunction if, it's not set in stone. That's what conditional means. So in this case, the conditional if is used to prove that the Duchess is dead, if that makes sense. So essentially what the Duke is doing is using this conditional conjunction if and suggesting that the Duchess is dead, because he's saying there she stands as if alive, but she's not actually alive. So that is kind of a complicated thing to say, and I tried to explain it as simply as possible, but don't worry if you don't understand it still. It is a very difficult linguistics topic, but as long as you just recognize that if is a conjunction, and B, want to introduce a conditional clause. So as long as you recognize that this conjunction if introduces a conditional clause being a clause that may or may not happen, right, you'll probably get marks, because what you're doing is recognizing that this conjunction if, this connecting word if, actually introduces another sentence which may or may not be true. In this case, the conjunction if is used to introduce this idea that the Duchess may or may not be alive, but of course that is simply the way that the Duke is talking. The Duke is talking as if the Duchess is dead. Now, whether she actually is dead, we still don't know. Remember, before this, we've got this idea of commands being given. He says, "I gave commands, then all smiles stopped together." There's this idea that the Duke is heavily implying that the Duchess is dead, but of course she might not be. We don't quite know what happened to the Duchess. The Duke hasn't outright stated that the Duchess has been killed. I mean, she might just have been taken away to some, I don't know, some other location, but most likely we can infer that she has been killed. We do that through inference. And so even this conjunction if is not set in stone. It is very, very purposefully vague, and it's almost as if the Duke is kind of mocking who he is talking to. He's kind of mocking the reader, and Browning does this on purpose to really showcase how, I guess, cruel the Duke is through this mocking language. It's as if the Duchess's life isn't important to him. It's not even important enough for him to state outright that he has killed her. So that's this sense that all these language features, this conditional if and this vague language, it just serves to highlight how disrespectful the Duke is when he is talking about the Duchess. And of course, he is referring to the painting, so he has kind of personified the painting. He does this at the beginning of the poem as well, where he kind of personifies this painting of the Duchess. There she stands, he uses that pronoun. But he is, of course, describing a painting, and paintings are objects. So there's this kind of idea that perhaps the Duke takes the painting very seriously, or he sees the painting as the Duchess herself, that this object is more human to the Duke than the real Duchess ever was when she was alive. And again, kind of cementing this idea that to the Duke, the painting of the Duchess is very much alive. She looks as if she were alive, and it suggests to us that the Duke is perhaps maybe a bit mentally unhinged, or perhaps unable to kind of separate the real Duchess from this painting of her. And we also talked about this in the first video, but perhaps the Duke prefers the painting of the Duchess because she only looks as if she were alive. She's not actually alive. And so there's this sense that because she is a painting, because he is able to control her, it's a lot easier for the Duke to control this painting of the Duchess than it ever was to control her. There's a sense that the Duke, again, prefers the painting and prefers this idea of the Duchess being conditionally alive, as if she were alive, than actually when she was truly alive. And then, of course, we've got another caesura. We've got tons and tons of caesura in this poem. And following this caesura is a question, a direct question. We've got that pronoun you. So just reminding us that the Duke is talking to someone. He is talking to the servant. And he has this question which he uses directly, which he says, "Wilt please you rise?" And of course, we've got that informal please, that noun please. Again, that fake humbleness, that fake politeness, this idea that the Duke is painting himself to be politer than he really is. "Wilt please you rise? We'll meet the company below then. I repeat, the Count, your master's known munificence, is ample warrant that no just pretence of mine for dowry will be disallowed." So what he's saying here is he's asking the servant to rise. So of course we've got this image of the Duke and the servant sitting together. Perhaps they're sat on kind of big plush chairs, viewing this massive painting of the Duchess on the wall, and we get the sense that the Duke is now rising up and imploring the servant to rise as well. He says, "Wilt please you rise? We'll meet the company below." And the company below in this case is the Count. And here, finally, we've got an actual kind of placing, we've got a situation happening, it's being painted here, that actually there is a real kind of, I guess, setting. Browning is kind of setting the scene finally at the end. And the scene is that there is a Count waiting downstairs, and the Count is the master of the person that the Duke has been talking to all along, which is how we get this idea that perhaps the Duke is talking to a servant, because the Count who the Duke intends to marry into, so it's the Count's daughter that he wants to marry, we find out later on here, the Count has a servant who has kind of been hired, I guess, to check out the Duke's life and to check and see if perhaps the Duke is good enough for the Count's daughter. So this real setting of the scene, it kind of gives this idea of perhaps a novel or a story. It's very, very rich. It's quite interesting because so far we've had this dramatic monologue where we just kind of go into the past and it's about the Duke and it's setting the scene of who the Duchess was, and now we're kind of pulled away from that and brought into the present. We're brought into present timing and we're kind of pulled into what's going on and the background behind this entire dramatic monologue. And the background is the Duke is talking to the servant of his future father-in-law, who is the Count. And we don't know who this Count is. We don't know much about him. We just know that he is a Count. So he is probably a very powerful man, perhaps even more powerful than the Duke. And that's kind of why the Duke is talking very politely to the Count's servant. We get the sense that the Duke has this desire to butter up the Count and get on his good side. And we get that really very much here. The Count, your master's known munificence. And munificence is a noun, and it basically means generosity. So it's a fancy word for generosity. So really, the Duke is definitely buttering up the Count to the Count's servant. Remember, the Count isn't actually there. It seems like the Count is maybe too important to be in the Duke's presence. It seems very much like the Count is perhaps too busy, he's too high up to be actually talking face to face with the Duke. Isn't that interesting? The fact that the Duke is kind of pandering to this Count, this mysterious and powerful Count, but the Count himself is unable to be in the presence of the Duke, so he simply hires a servant to get that out of the way. And yeah, it's just really interesting to me, because we've got this arrogant, egotistical Duke, but actually he's kind of being put in his place in this poem. He's kind of buttering up the servant of someone who he's trying to, get into good books with. It's very interesting. But he's saying, the Count, your master's known munificence. So basically, the Count, your master, your servant's master, he has a known generosity, right? So he's saying, oh, your master is very generous. And then he says, there's ample warrant that no pretense of mine for dowry will be disallowed. So, interesting. I've brought up a new slide just because it is a bit of a complicated line here. So what he is saying is, the Count, your master's known munificence, known generosity, is ample warrant, is ample reason, is a big enough reason that no just pretense of mine for dowry will be disallowed. Essentially, what the Duke here is saying is that the Count is so generous, he will not make excuses. He will give the Duke a huge dowry. So, for obvious reasons, dowries are illegal in pretty much every country. I think in loads of countries, at least, dowries are illegal because women aren't objects. But obviously back then, in that time, in Browning's time, and in the 1500s, when this poem was set, dowries were a huge thing, especially in aristocratic families. So what the Duke is saying is that the Count is so generous that, of course, he will give me a big dowry. Though, pause, and that's a semicolon, though, however, so we've got that conjunction though, and remember, this though is very similar to but. Conjunctions are used to change the topic or introduce a new topic, and they are spoken features. So he adds, though his fair daughter's self, as I avowed as starting, is my object. So what the Duke is saying here is that the Count is so generous, your master the Count is so generous that he will definitely give me a huge dowry. Pause. However, his fair, his beautiful daughter, as I said from the beginning, is the true prize. So what he's saying is that he would love a dowry, and that the Count is so generous, he would definitely give the Duke a big dowry. However, the Duke only really wants the beautiful daughter of the Count, right? So there's a sense we get that the Duke intends to marry next. He wants a new Duchess, and he's got his sights set on the Count's daughter, this powerful Count's daughter. And so he is buttering up. He is essentially really kind of going for it. He calls the Count's daughter fair. Fair, that adjective used back in those days, meant beautiful. To be fair was to be very beautiful. And he says he promised this from the beginning. He always said this, he always, as I avowed at starting, I always said this, is my true object, is his object. Now notice that noun object. Now that's a very interesting noun to use to describe the next Duchess that the Duke intends to marry. Object, of course, being something that is property, something that is owned. You own an object. So again, we get this real sense that the Duke intends to remarry and treat his new wife as an object. He calls her fair, he calls her beautiful. We do get the sense that the Duchess that has been killed was also a very beautiful object to the Duke. And notice how, again, no name is mentioned. It's just that noun daughter, which is used to refer to the next Duchess. But there is no name mentioned. Even we don't know, what her station is. We just know that her dad is the Count, and that's all that seems to matter, really. And this is the only mention of the next Duchess. We've got this two-sentence situation happening here, which refers to the Duke's intention. So he basically wants to remarry, he wants to marry the Count's daughter, but he only really mentions that daughter, in this bit of the poem. The rest of the poem is focused on his previous wife. So it definitely seems as if he is still hung up on the previous Duchess. But again, just like the previous Duchess, no names are mentioned. None of the women that the Duke talks about has an identity. She is either a Duchess because she is married to the Duke, or she is a daughter because she is a daughter to the Count. It seems like the Duke, when he is talking about women, he only refers to them by their relationship with men. So the Duchess Now, my last Duchess is simply a Duchess because she has married the Duke, the true subject of the poem, and his next wife is a fair daughter, right? She's a fair daughter, and she is a fair daughter because she is a daughter to the Count, right? This important man. And that is all that seems to matter to the Duke. He doesn't seem to view women with their own identities. And this is even more reinforced by possessive pronoun, my object. So my object, not just an object, not just a kind of piece of property to be owned, but my object. And this really highlights how the Duke views women and views his wives and how he kind of sees women in his life. Finally, we have my favourite bit of the poem. I just love this bit of the poem because it is the end of the poem, and B, because it is such a fantastic piece of symbolism. I absolutely love it. He goes, "Nay, we'll go together down." So he's basically saying, together we'll go down, we'll actually face the Count. So you get the sense that the Duke and the servant are rising and they're just going down to meet the Count, butter him up and make him kind of want to give his daughter over to the Duke. And then we've got this aside, again, caesura, and then this aside. And the poem actually ends on this. He goes, "Notice Neptune though." Now, the first thing we want to notice is the alliteration. You might have already picked up on this a couple of times, that notice Neptune alliteration, which only serves to, I guess, emphasize how, I guess, planned this poem is. It's got this kind of rhyme scheme, it's got this rhythm to it, and it's got a lot of caesuras to it for dramatic purposes. And then at the end, we've got notice Neptune though, and we've got that embedded kind of though. Makes the Duke seem as if he is speaking spontaneously, but of course he is not. He is not speaking spontaneously at all. Everything he's saying is planned. And also, please clock that notice Neptune though is what's known as a command, or an imperative is basically a command, and he's actually commanding. Right, he's commanding the servant to stop and look, and this contrasts this noun sir, this seemingly polite noun, and then suddenly we've got this command, and he's saying, "Notice Neptune though, taming a seahorse, thought a rarity, which Klaus of Innsbruck cast in bronze for me." So there's a sculpture of Neptune, and Neptune is the mythological god of the sea. And in this sculpture, Neptune is taming a seahorse. So taming being kind of controlling a seahorse. Not just controlling, but turning that seahorse from a wild creature into one that is more tame, more subservient, more willing to listen, willing to agree to his commands. That's what taming is. When you turn something wild and free into something very quiet and controlled. So essentially what Neptune is doing is he's probably whipping or taming, making a seahorse kind of bend to his commands. And look at the verb taming. Now, taming is in the continuous present tense. So Neptune is taming the seahorse. It's carrying on. It's happening now. It's continuing. Now, this is a very interesting little metaphor. Browning uses this metaphor to describe the Duke, right? Now, what has the Duke done with the Duchess that he has killed? He has essentially tamed her. He wants to control any Duchess in his life. He wants to stop her from doing the things that she wants to do. He essentially views himself as this god, and he views any Duchess of his, or any wife of his, as a seahorse whom he is taming, continuously taming. So first of all, look at the fact that the Duke kind of views himself as a god and views any Duchesses in his life as this animal. A seahorse is an animal. He kind of dehumanizes them, doesn't he? if we are looking at this metaphor as an example of the Duke, which we should be looking at this metaphor as an example of the Duke, we see how the Duke elevates himself into God status and seems to demote any woman in his life to an animal, less than human. And we see how egotistical he is, but not just egotistical, but completely demeaning to women. Also, look at the fact that this is a statue that the Duke has of Neptune. It's a statue. Again, it's a piece of art. Just like the painting of the Duchess, which the Duke uses to, I guess, control the Duchess even after her death, this statue of Neptune taming a seahorse is another way that the Duke uses art to symbolize his life. Just as the Duke uses the painting of the Duchess to symbolize his relationship with the Duchess, he only lets certain people see that painting of the Duchess, for example. He uses that painting of the Duchess to, I guess, entrap her into living with him. And we talked a bit about this in the first video, this idea that the painting of the Duchess is used by the Duke to carry on controlling her even after she has died, as if she is constantly in his clutches, constantly in his control, and constantly immortalized as this object to the Duke. This statue of Neptune taming a seahorse is another way that the Duke and Browning, as the poet, makes and uses symbolism. He uses this statue of Neptune taming a seahorse as a way of showing everyone his life and what he wants, right? So this statue of Neptune is a metaphor for the Duke's life, just as the painting of the Duchess is a metaphor for the Duchess's life. We get the sense that the Duke wants to tame everyone around him, and he has done this with the Duchess as well. He has tamed her, he has controlled her, he has essentially taken her freedom away by taking her life away, that's implied, and turning her into this painting. And even throughout the whole poem, he has tamed her through his language. He uses sexual language and polite tones and kind of manipulation in his language to present the Duchess a certain way. You know, he talks about her blushing, he talks about her wrist, he talks about her body, and he even talks about her depth and passion, her glance. He essentially breaks her down into this object and controls her through his very language. And in a sense, he's doing that. He's taming her, just as Neptune is taming a seahorse. Even when the Duchess was alive, he constantly attempted to tame her. He wanted her not to look at anyone but him. He wanted her not to smile at anyone but him. And so there's a sense that the Duke uses art, right? He uses paintings, he uses statues to show people who he really is. And to show people what he really wants out of life. Even this painting of the Duchess, this trapped painting of the Duchess, controlled by the Duke, controlled by these curtains that the Duke has put up so that only specific people can see this painting of the Duchess. Controlled because she can only look at certain people that the Duke allows her to look at. That is another example of what the Duke wants and how he shows this through art. And again, this statue of Neptune taming a seahorse, again, using art as an example to show people what the Duke truly wants. He wants to tame those around him. He wants to be a god. Neptune is the god of the sea. But furthermore, Neptune is the Latin name for the god of the sea. Neptune actually symbolizes the marriage of heaven and earth as well, just in case you were interested, because he is the god of the sea. He symbolizes the marriage of heaven and earth. And there's definitely this kind of theme of heaven and earth, this idea that the Duchess is perhaps dead in heaven and the Duke is on earth. There's definitely kind of the symbolism throughout the whole poem of marriage, of heaven and earth, this idea that the Duchess might be in heaven, she might be dead, but in a way the Duke is kind of dragging her down onto earth and constantly remembering her through this painting of her. I guess it's kind of complicated. Maybe it's a bit of a reach to you, but it could be kind of interesting to discuss the symbolism of Neptune and what he represents. He is the god of water, water and the sea being, of course, quite volatile. Volatile is when something is kind of crazy. Sea has a lot of waves. The sea can be very dangerous. And the sea can also be quite calm, and it is an element of nature. So we could see how the sea is dangerous, representing the Duke, but the sea can also be something quite beautiful and calm, perhaps representing the Duchess. And we've got this kind of sense that the two subjects of the poem are the dangerous Duke and the calm Duchess. Sorry, that's kind of cut out, but that's meant to say two subjects. So there's this sense of the sea being many different things, and this poem showing many different things. The poem shows who the Duchess truly was, and the poem shows who the Duke really was, and it's all represented through the symbolism of Neptune, god of the sea. Taming a seahorse, continuous verb, trying to control this seahorse, and the seahorse representation of how the Duke views women. A seahorse, a very beautiful creature. Seahorses are considered stunning creatures, but controlled, right? Tamed, and very small creatures as well, very easy to control. Thought a rarity which Claus of Innsbruck cast in bronze for me really encapsulates how great this poem is, this Browning poem is the fact that the poem ends on that personal pronoun, me. And as I've told you before, if you look through this poem and you see how many pronouns the Duke uses to refer to himself, it's always me and my. So it really, really emphasizes how egotistical the Duke truly is. And that emphasis is almost cemented by the fact that the poem ends in me. Right? Ultimately, the poem is about the Duke, even though it seems as if the subject is about the Duchess. Even in the title, we have My Last Duchess, and by the time we get to this part of the poem, I think it should be pretty obvious that it is a poem about the Duke, and who the Duke truly, truly is, and how the Duke views himself, and also perhaps how the Duke doesn't view himself, but what we see in the Duke, this idea that the Duke thinks he is very powerful and egotistical, but throughout the poem he seems to beg for this mysterious Count's attention and almost butter up this mysterious Count and his servant. And he clearly uses a lot of metaphors through his artwork to really, I guess, emphasize how powerful he is. But there is this sense that perhaps the Duke is simply doing this because inside he feels less powerful than he really is. Hopefully I have squeezed as much as I can out of this poem for you, and hopefully this has helped you a little bit. So this is finally the end of the 3-part series analysing Robert Browning's My Last Duchess, one of my favourite poems in this anthology. Absolutely loved doing this one, and I hope you loved listening to me as well. Thank you.